about the importance of small groups at your local church. Christians, if you are a Christian, atheists, this is probably where you're going to tune out. But Christians, we were looking at some recent Lifeway research material, or at least I was, and I showed Braxton like 30 seconds before the stream started. But Lifeway did a study on churches seeing new commitments to Christ, and then they talked about small groups in churches, and then they also talked about volunteering, like people in the local church, how much they volunteer inside the church and how much they volunteer to go do community service type activities. And that's an interesting one. But the Lifeway research one, a Lifeway research study finds church growth requires active small groups, focused evangelism, and assimilation of new believers. By Marissa, Pastel Sullivan. As churches continue ministry in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, many are finding it increasingly difficult to grow their small groups. However, churches continue to report new commitments and changed lives. So people are still getting saved in churches. There's a chart that shows how that reporting goes. And they say that the average U.S. Protestant church saw 15 new commitments in the past 12 months. But this also is broken down later in the article about church size and whatever. But you can see that 29% say there's one to four, so it's fewer. But as churches have struggled to develop small group attendees, large numbers of new commitments to Christ are becoming less common. In the past 12 months, Protestant churches have seen an average of 15 new commitments to Christ. Churches are likely to say they've seen at least 1 to 4 commitments in the past year, 29%. Around 1 in 5 say they have seen 5 to 9, or 10 to 19, 20% new commitments. Fewer are on the extremes of having no commitments, which is 17%, or 20 or more, which is 13%. Compared to 2010, fewer churches today are seeing at least 20 new commitments to Christ in a year, 20%. So that number's up. The churches that have big events like where Braxton Hunter comes in and 45 people get saved on that Sunday. Another piece of data from this, though, shows that when new Christians, when they become Christians in a church, they actually stay in that church and they become more involved than other regular attenders. I thought that was interesting. Like a new and that makes me wonder, are the old hat Christians sitting around in these churches, they've just kind of checked out of everything but the Sunday morning, right? They're like, I did the small groups for a while. Or if this is Sunday school, I did that.
Well, it makes sense that your zeal might be heightened when you first become a Christian.
Yeah.
You're ready to hey, I'm ready to do all the things, Yeah. So
you know what there needs to be research done on, though? I'm wondering if all of these internet happy apologists and theologians who are like the theology geeks and apologetics geeks, I wonder what their participation in the local church looks like. Has that?
Yeah, I talk with the guys that I'm friends with, and they have a healthy.
They are participating in a small group, or they or lead a small group or whatever.
Well, I don't know about small groups, honestly.
I mean, are we just talking about they attend a local church regularly for a service?
Well, a lot of these guys also make help with resources for their church, like we do, and stuff like that. So, I don't know, but it's a good point about small groups. I don't know.
So what they're arguing is in this article, this Lifeway research, that small group is on the decline, right? So I think it's down from. There's a chart that shows the participation on down in that. If you want to pull that chart up, participation in small group, shrinking percentage of church growers. So this is now. If you go back in time, you and I are old enough. We were alive and adults in 2008. You remember in the mid 2000s the big push to move away from Sunday school to small groups.
Yeah.
Maybe that even goes back even to the late 90s, early 2000s. But that would have been like its peak of the small group movement. What was that, 2006, 2008, something like that? But you can see it's on a downward trend, right? And that correlates to more churches having fewer to no new commitments.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not saying cause it. I'm saying that correlates with that. And so I think that's interesting because, we hear a lot about evangelism. You're an evangelist. We talk a lot about evangelism. We just talked about revival in the last episode live stream. We've talked about like evangelistic events. We've had several shows on that. But it's still the case that personal evangelism seems to be the vehicle, and small group or Sunday school classes is the vehicle within that, right? That brings about growth in churches. Mm-hmm. And it goes on to say about smaller churches, like the smallest churches have the fewest members. Like if a church has 50 members or less, the smallest churches have the smallest percentage of people in that small church participating in small groups. So you think that the one thing you would want to do if you were in a small church is to create a small group, right? And try to work out from there and try to push that.
Well, part of it is small groups are more than or different in depending. I mean, there's so many different ways to do a small group, but it's kind of like Sunday school, just not at church in a certain sense. Now, it may not be so rigorously structured so that there is definitely a teacher and they're going to lecture. Maybe you can raise your hand and ask a question or whatever, but a lot of Sunday schools are already like small groups anyway. So it's kind of like just taking Sunday school and moving it out into the community. Well, I'm not surprised. I always thought this back in the day, like when I pastored, we had a Sunday school.
Yeah. But
when you're doing it through the week and not at church, it's easier to get someone to participate that way. Whatever you want to say about whether this is good or not, it's easier to get someone to participate that way if they're already going to be at church, and they know that if they're already going to be at church, everybody else is going to Sunday school.
Yeah.
So the small group thing is difficult. The great thing about it is, you get some people out of the church. People are more willing to go to someone's house. You can make kind of a little party out of it. You can have some chips and drinks or whatever. Maybe you grill out occasionally. Maybe you do other things. But once you're out of the church, man, it's hard to corral these people into small groups.
But I think most people, but I think inviting people to small groups and then from there getting them to the worship service seems to be still the mechanism that this article is pushing towards, and it just needs to be. And I think that's correct because, for most people, I think that the small group, the one area that I think Sunday school works better than small group, I'll say, is for not young in age, but for new parents, because a lot of parents want to be able to get involved in these small groups, but I've seen at least 3 churches comparable to the size of ours where their smallest group was actually young parents because nobody and this goes back to the volunteer thing that we're going to talk about. Like nobody wanted to volunteer to be the ones who watched a whole bunch of kids on a Tuesday night while all the other new parents.
It's hard enough to get somebody to watch the nursery during the service.
Yeah, amen. Now, I've done it.
Well, I haven't, but I was the pastor, so I felt like I had a reason. I was in the pulpit.
Well, we are at a church now where you could volunteer to do it.
You need to stop.
Right.
Okay.
Braxton here,
Spartan
you
theology
just heard it. Braxton's too good to change diapers in the
They're not looking for a lot of grown men with beards to keep it. Okay, Spartan theology says that's interesting because my experience was as I studied theology more, it got harder to participate in small groups because of all the disagreements. That's true. That could be.
Well, that could be simply...
In fact, a lot of the guys that end up in our online groups, theology-based groups, not necessarily the apologetics, but those two probably, but the theology geeks, the people that want to argue Calvinism and open theism and all this stuff all the time.
Yeah, they're the ones starting the disagreements in the small groups and being the cancer that destroys the camaraderie. That's what I think.
What I'm saying is they will sometimes, because they study this on their own throughout the week and become obsessed like we do, even if they don't become obsessed, they're just interested in it. They come to know more, at least about particular issues, than some of the people in the class. And so that can lead to a difficult time, I guess. Because you want to be in a group where you can grow and ask questions and all that. But number one, if you feel like you know more than everyone else in the group, not that that's a good way to think about yourself all the time, but realistically, if you know more theology than the people in this group and we're talking about these theological ideas,
So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I shouldn't tell all of the theology geeks to start small groups and be the teacher, because all they're going to do is you're going to become the person who is like the theology police for your small group, while simultaneously on Twitter griping about the theology police of some other tribe and theological tribe you oppose. Right? I could totally see that happening. So
Gregory Fisher's got small groups at his church.
Yeah.
I think. Or the one they revitalized. Okay, I'm currently trying to get a small groups program off the ground in my humanist congregation. The struggle is real. So here, now you might do this.
Invite Christians.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if I want to encourage him, but what we do okay, so here's what we do. Lee Strobel first discussed this when he was back at, what's the name of the church that was up there near Chicago?
Willow Creek.
Willow Creek, yeah. Willowbrook? Willow Creek?
Willow Creek.
Wow. Anyway, he started these small groups there where anybody could come. You could be an atheist. You could ask whatever you wanted. You didn't have, don't worry about offending us. Just be respectful and, that sort of thing. And saw a lot of people come and start asking questions, and some people became Christians and all that. So that's what I did here in town. And you came to that group a few times. I did it for a few years with a college group here, and we had atheists coming in, agnostics, people of other religions. And it worked. I mean, it's kind of cool when you just start out and say, hey, I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then we're just going to ask questions and chat, and that sort of thing. But you can ask whatever you want. If you can say, I don't believe none of that you're saying right now, or I think that's stupid, or whatever. Try to be respectful, but that's fine. You can ask questions.